Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. I have a fun video for you guys today. What I'm going to do is go over 10 things I wish I knew at the beginning of my Linux career, things that I found out much later on that I wish somebody would have told me when I first started. And you know what? Let's just dive right into it and go over my 10 things that I wish I knew at the beginning of my career. Now, the first one I'm going to go over is something that might be obvious to a lot of you, but again, these are things that I wish I knew at the beginning of my career, and I did discover this kind of early on, but I wish I actually discovered this earlier on than I did. And that is the concept that unused RAM is wasted RAM. Now think of it this way. If there's certain files that you open constantly or, a program that you open all the time, then you're going to want to have that, load as fast as possible. The things that you use on a regular basis, you definitely want to have those launch as quickly as possible and be right there ready for you as soon as you're ready for it. And the idea behind this is that things launch faster from RAM than they do from a hard disk. Nowadays, we have solid-state drives like NVMe drives and things like that, so we're not really hurting for speed here, but RAM is still faster than even the fastest SSD available. So even though we've had a lot of advancements, it's still true that unused RAM is wasted RAM. Basically, the way this works, and I'm overly simplifying this, you have a cache when it comes to memory on Linux, and even though that cache actually takes up memory, memory from that cache can be absolutely provided to any application that needs it. So if you have a lot of RAM being used up by the cache, you might be thinking, wow, I don't really have any memory left to launch even Firefox or something like that. But the truth is, anytime an application launches and needs memory, then the Linux kernel is going to provide memory to that application, even if that means taking something out of the cache. The whole idea here is that the operating system should manage all of this for you, and you shouldn't even have to pay attention to it. Now, the thing is, a lot of you guys are probably thinking that this is a very obvious thing, but it might not be as obvious as you think. But sometimes this concept actually causes a negative opinion that's not really fair. For example, take the GNOME desktop. A lot of people accuse it of being bloated and just wasting memory, but that's absolutely not true. Now, if you install the GNOME desktop on your computer and then you launch no application, you simply just log in, you don't launch anything, and then you look at the memory usage, you might see a gig or more is being used. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because when you install the GNOME desktop, your memory usage appears to be higher, that the memory, efficiency is lower. Actually, it's the opposite. The GNOME desktop is very fast and efficient. And sometimes I wonder if this misunderstanding about RAM is part of the reason why people keep accusing it of being bloated. Now, the next thing that I want to go over, something that I wish I understood earlier on during my career, and that is that sometimes high CPU usage is a good thing. And considering the fact that I came up in my career as a system administrator, this is something that I ran into quite often. Now, although I didn't know this at the beginning of my career, now that I've had, a lot of years in system administration, after I was more seasoned, I would have people call me up, clients and things like that, and they would be asking me things like, why is the CPU always at 70%? That doesn't seem right. And what I would do is respond back to them, well, there's no issue. You are paying for the server because you want it to do work. If it's 70% utilized, well, it's doing work. I would be more concerned if the CPU was closer to 0% utilized. That often means that a process died or something that should be running isn't running, because a server that has very low CPU usage, I would argue, shouldn't even exist. I mean, why are you going to spin up a Linux server if you don't have any work for it to do? Servers exist to perform tasks, to do actual work. So again, if the CPU usage is low, that's a big concern to me. If it's on the higher side, as long as it's under control, that's not really a problem. That means you're actually getting your money's worth. Your server is performing work, which is why it exists in the first place. Now, the third one is fairly simple, but this is something that I didn't run into until years later when I was getting into Linux. And the issue was this. I had a server that was complaining that its disk was full. However, when I logged into it and I checked the actual available space on that server, it showed me that there was plenty of space available. So I was like, wait a minute, the alerting system is telling me that the disk is full, but when I look at it, there's, plenty of space available, so what's up with that? At the time, I didn't understand the concept of inodes. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to go into a deep dive detail about inodes themselves, but basically you have to keep track of inodes as well as available space on your hard disks. Now, most of the time, inodes are not a problem. If inodes become a problem, then usually that's evident of a bigger problem. Now, the first time I ran into this, I was actually maintaining an email server, and for some reason, that server stopped sending email. So what I realized actually is that the number of files was astronomical. I mean, I don't even remember how many files there were, but just imagine an email server that a lot of people use, and then all of a sudden, emails are stuck. They're just not leaving the server, so they keep stacking and stacking and stacking, and next thing you know, the server ran out of inodes. And to overly simplify the inode issue here, when you have a storage volume on Linux, you have a certain amount of space available, and that's not unlike any other storage volume. I don't care if you're running Windows, Mac OS, you're already familiar with the fact that your disk can only hold so much data. But when it comes to inodes, the number of files becomes a real issue. So when that happens, you can run a command like df-h, and it'll show you that you have a bunch of space available. But when you go to save a new file, it tells you that you're out of space. And that actually seems like something that, well, conflicts, right? I mean, how could you have a lot of space available and you can't store a single file? Again, inodes. In this case, what you do is you type df-I for inodes, and that'll tell you how many inodes you have available. Most of the time, you'll have well over 99% when it comes to available inodes, because most of the time this is never an issue. Again, anytime this is an issue, it's usually evident of a much bigger problem. But I just wanted you guys to be aware of it, because if you ever have a situation where a server is complaining that it's out of space, but it doesn't appear that it actually is out of space, definitely run the df-I command to check the inodes. That could actually be the problem. Now, the next thing that I want to go over is the fact that there's so many Linux distributions. I thought it was a bad thing when I first started out with Linux. I mean, I didn't even know which distribution to choose, and it made starting all that much harder. So for the longest time, I actually thought that the number of distributions that are available today, I mean, there's well over 100, I thought that was a bad thing. But what I wish I knew and understood at the beginning of my time with Linux is that having a bunch of distributions available is actually a great thing. In fact, it's a superpower. Now think of it this way. When it comes to macOS or Windows, they provide a user experience for you, and you really don't have much of a choice. When it comes to macOS, they've designed the, file menu, how the windows are, how applications open, and other than maybe changing the color scheme or changing the wallpaper, you really don't have much control over how to customize your desktop. And the same is also true when it comes to Windows. I mean, sure, there's some adjustments, like I mentioned, like color schemes and things like that. So it's not like you don't have any option, but you don't really have that many. What if you really didn't like the user interface at all? Well, on Windows and Mac OS, tough luck. You either use the user interface that they provide you with, or just use a different operating system. Now, to be fair, I am aware of the fact that there's, utilities to skin the user experience and things like that, especially with Windows. But in my experience, when you do things like that, something that the provider of the operating system didn't intend for, then, well, things aren't quite as stable and you could actually crash the entire thing. I know because I've actually done it. But when it comes to Linux, it's fully modular. That's why we have so many distributions. So if you don't like the user interface of a Linux distribution, then, well, stop using it and use something else. If you're not a fan of GNOME, or maybe you prefer Plasma or something like that, you can simply choose a desktop distribution that centers around that desktop environment. So basically, having a bunch of distributions available means you have more choice. If you try a distribution and you decide that you really don't like it, that doesn't mean that Linux is a bad fit, that it's not a good fit for you. That just means you don't really like that distribution. You can simply try a different one and keep repeating the process until you land on something that you enjoy using. When it comes to macOS and Windows, you're pretty much just stuck with the UI, like I mentioned, the UI that they've provided you, and I actually think that's a big weakness of those platforms. Now, for the next thing that I want to mention, I want to bring up LVM. And this is actually the first of 2 times I'll be mentioning LVM on this list, so I guess I gave you a bit of a spoiler. But the first point I want to make is that you should use LVM. Now, LVM itself stands for Logical Volume Manager, and it's a really big topic, but it's not all that difficult to learn. I have an entire video on this channel already that'll teach it to you. But what LVM allows you to do is it gives you more control over your storage. It's an abstraction of storage, so to speak. So you could do things like, combine multiple disks together as one volume, and it'll act like one volume. And that's not quite unlike RAID, but don't confuse LVM with RAID because it's not a RAID solution at all. What it is an abstraction on top of your storage that gives you even more features. And one of the biggest things about LVM that I like is that you could resize file systems online. For example, let's say you have a cloud server, and that cloud server has a 100 gigabyte storage volume. But for whatever reason, you need to upgrade that. Maybe 100 gigabytes isn't really enough anymore. You thought it would be enough, but it's really not. Now, what you could do, obviously, is set up a new volume, and you could just rsync all the files over to that volume and do it the manual way. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to LVM, you could resize a storage volume online. That means you could add a new virtual disk to a cloud server, for example, and you could add that to your LVM setup and then expand your available space to include that hard drive as well, allowing you to grow your storage to meet your needs. And you could do that without shutting down the server. And that's the brilliant part about this, because if you maintain Linux servers, I think you'll really appreciate being able to do things like that without shutting it down. Now, it's fully possible that if you do set up LVM on your server, that you might not ever use its features. Maybe that's just not something you'll run into. I used the example of expanding storage. Maybe that's just not something you'll end up doing. In that case, it doesn't hurt to have LVM on your server because it's not going to affect your performance. But if you do have a use case for it, sometime down the road, I think you will absolutely appreciate the fact that you set up the server with LVM, because it's one of those things that could come in handy. Now let's move on to the fifth thing that I wish I knew when I first started with Linux. And I think this is going to help a lot of you out there that are complete beginners, because you might be overwhelmed with all of the commands and things that you have to learn. Maybe you're thinking, how do I memorize all this stuff? So how exactly do I go through the process of memorizing all these commands? Well, actually, that brings me right to my point. And the thing that I wish I knew at the beginning of my career is that you don't have to memorize Linux commands. In fact, nobody memorizes Linux commands at all. Now, if you've been watching my content for a while, you might actually think that I have all of these commands memorized. I mean, how can I even teach them to you if I didn't? Well, the truth of the matter is, there's going to be some commands that I use basically every single day. So yeah, those commands I absolutely have memorized, but the only reason I have those memorized is because I use them every day. But when it comes to Linux commands, there's just way too many for anybody to memorize. If your goal is to memorize all of them, you are not going to succeed. I mean, sure, you probably could memorize, one or two use cases for each command if you really tried hard, but considering how many options there are, I really don't think it's possible. In fact, sometimes I actually consult my own books when it comes to how to run a specific command. If it's a command that I just don't use all that often, I will forget how to use that command. And I will actually sometimes reach for my own book. No, I'm not kidding. I will literally reach for my own books as my own reference sometimes when I want to remember how to use a command. Now, obviously, not everybody writes books, but what most people do is they just have their own cheat sheets. Maybe they have some text files with their favorite commands in there and their favorite variations of those commands, and they just look at those text files anytime they want to remember how they did something in the past. Some administrators will actually just check through the bash history on a server to find out how they did something, last year or something like that, something that they don't do often. For example, if you're the type of person that doesn't have LVM memorized and you want to expand a file system, well, in my case, I don't even have that memorized. I don't actually expand file systems every day, so I'll never have a chance to memorize that. But I have done that a number of times, and I have it written down in my notes. So anytime I actually need to do that, I'll just look it up and then I'll go ahead and do it. And then later on, if I do that enough times, maybe I will memorize that command. But if you're trying to memorize, everything, then just stop. It's just not going to happen because you're human and you're just giving yourself a hard time. Now, as a related aside to this, I think something that really perpetuates the myth that you have to memorize all this stuff is the fact that, certification exams often force you to memorize a lot of things, and I really don't agree with that. When you are working with real Linux servers, you always have access to documentation. I don't care if you are working with an offline Linux server, you at least have the man pages there for you, so you'll always have at your fingertips a way to look up commands and what they do. Now, when it comes to certification exams, they really do seem to expect you to memorize a bunch of things, and like I said, I really think this is kind of where this, comes from, but the thing is, they're asking you to memorize a bunch of things that you're probably not going to use by the time you become a real Linux administrator. When I became certified, there were several things that I looked at, like who would actually use this on a daily basis, and how is this particular bash script even useful in the real world? Well, chances are it's probably not. There's a lot of trick questions when it comes to these exams, and again, they force you to memorize a bunch of things, but I really feel like these certification exams are absolutely sending the wrong message. In the real world, we have documentation, we have man pages, we We have everything that we need right at our fingertips, so there really isn't a need to memorize everything. You're just wasting your time. And also your sanity. So moving right along, what's another thing that I wish I knew when I first started? Well, one thing that I think is really important is to have a backup distribution. Now the thing is, what most people will do is settle on one Linux distribution as their tried and true distro that they use on basically everything. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we all have our favorite distribution, but you should always have a plan B. Perhaps your main distribution someday just won't exist. If that day was to come, what are you going to do? If you don't have a plan B, then you're going to be trying to figure out which distribution you want to move to. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably thinking that your distro of choice will never go anywhere. It'll always be there. It's a popular distribution that a bunch of people use, and it's just going to be there forever. However, you'd be surprised. I mean, take CentOS, for example. I'm not going to get on a soapbox as far as whether or not I think their new distribution release cycle is a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact is it did change. Whether you're against it or for it, well, it still changed. It's still a change that actually happened. For some people, moving to CentOS Stream is just not something that some administrators wanted to do. They just didn't feel like that particular type of distribution is something that they can actually be okay with. So in this case, you had CentOS, something that everybody thought would always be the same, would always be there, and then all of a sudden it changed. It's completely different now, and for some people, they like it a lot better, but for others, it's just not something they want to consider using. Now, in that situation, any Linux administrator that has a Plan B distro that they're always testing things on and, keeping in their back pocket, those individuals at that point were in a very good place. Because in that case, they already have the next distribution decided upon because they had a Plan B. But for those of you out there that don't have a Plan B, and especially for companies that don't have a Plan B, especially when the CentOS switch happened, well, they were left in a very, very bad position. They had to, all of a sudden, if they didn't want to go with CentOS Stream, test their software on a different distribution and then move to a different distribution, and that's a lot of work. But if you have a Plan B distribution that you test things on every now and then you're already a step ahead when it comes to moving to another distribution. And you never know, you might actually have to someday. When it comes to Linux distributions, nothing is guaranteed and nothing is promised. The distribution that you're using today might not exist tomorrow, and even if it does, it could completely change. And if it does, you might love the change or you might hate it. But if you hate it and you have no Plan B, well, you're in for a lot of work. Just always have a Plan B, something in your back pocket that you could decide to use if you have to, and I think you'll definitely appreciate having that. Next, let's talk about Git. When it comes to version control, Git is my favorite version control solution, but technically, when it comes to the point that I'm about to make, you could probably insert another version control system in here and it would still be true. But the thing that I wish I knew at the beginning of my Linux career is that, well, Git is not just for software developers. I mean, sure, Git is very popular with software developers and it's probably the primary use case, but when it comes to system administration, especially Linux administration, version control is awesome. It's a great way to keep track of your config files. Just like developers do, you could track changes to those files, revert back to previous versions of those files. So if you have, config files in the etc directory, maybe even your Apache files, for example, you could actually put them in version control. And then if something happens and something stops working, you could simply revert everything back to a known working state. Now, sure, you don't want to include anything secret in any version control repository. For example, don't put your, private keys in there or anything like that. Just be very mindful of that. But as long as you don't make that mistake, I think version control, Git and things like Git are very useful for Linux administration. Because, like I mentioned, you have a history of changes available at any time you need it. You can go back to previous versions. You could test new changes and then roll right back. So learning Git is something that I highly recommend that every Linux administrator does because it'll absolutely come in handy. On my end, I actually thought that version control was just for software developers, and I ignored it for quite a while. It's definitely something you'll absolutely want to take advantage of. Now, speaking of being able to roll back to previous configurations, did you know that LVM has a snapshot feature? Well, actually, I know that now, but I didn't know that for quite a while. I think I went for years before I actually knew that LVM had a snapshot feature, and it's actually really good. As I mentioned earlier, LVM is actually an abstraction on top of your storage. So basically, you format your hard disk, you install LVM on top of it, and then after that, you install whatever file system you want to have for your storage. And sure, I'm oversimplifying this, But the thing is, you could actually take a snapshot of your storage volume with LVM, and then what you could do is try out, I don't know, a new piece of software, and then you could revert the snapshot back or delete the snapshot, just get rid of it if you don't want to save it, and then everything is back the way it was. Now, if you've ever used virtual machine snapshots before, it's not completely unlike that. It's actually very similar. Now, of course, it's something that you have to learn, but I highly recommend that you learn LVM. And again, I have a whole video on this channel already that gives you a deep dive into LVM, and I highly recommend that you learn it, especially for the snapshot feature. It's just really, really awesome. Now, for the last thing on my list, we're actually going to talk about LVM again, but it's not so much about LVM, it's about how you're backing up your servers, specifically cloud servers. Now, if you maintain cloud servers on your end, then you definitely want to pay attention to this one. Now, sure, some of you may have already figured this out earlier on, but some of you may not have. I actually learned the hard way, which is why I wanted to make sure that I put it on this particular list. Anyway, what this particular point is that you should always make sure you take all the individual volumes into account when you back up a server. That may sound obvious, but you'd be surprised. I've actually seen some administrators that have a bunch of years experience actually get bit by this. So to explain the situation, what I'll do is give you a hypothetical example. Let's say, for example, you have a cloud server with a 20 gigabyte hard disk. Maybe, I don't know, you just thought that would be enough. And maybe you took my advice and you set up LVM on that server, so that way you could expand the storage and grow it online and benefit from additional storage anytime you wanted to. So let's say that the server was starting to become full, so you added another virtual disk and you added it to your LVM configuration, and then you expanded to that second disk. And maybe it happened again. Maybe you added yet another 20 gigabyte volume. Now you have 3, and you expanded everything to take into account those 3 volumes. Well, so far, that's a great way to use LVM. That's actually one of the major benefits. But when it comes to backing up that server, a mistake that a lot of administrators make is they only back up the first hard drive. Now think about that for a minute. If you've added a few virtual disks to your VM and you've expanded LVM across those, but you only back up one of those disks, then you don't have the whole picture. You're going to have data on the other volumes as well. So if you don't actually back up all of your volumes, then you're not going to be able to restore that backup. Now, sure, you should absolutely test your backups. And if you did, well, you would know about this problem before it actually becomes a problem. So there you go. Those were 10 things that I wish I knew at the beginning of my Linux career. And there's going to be a whole lot of things that I wish I knew at the beginning of my career. That's actually why I've created this channel, so I could teach you guys the things that I wish I knew earlier on. That's the whole point of this channel. I just love to teach you guys things. But anyway, considering that I've been using Linux for a very long time now, there's going to be a lot more things that I could have added to this list. So if you want to see another video just like this one to go over even more things that I wish I knew at the beginning of my career, then let me know in the comments down below, and you never know, I might do a follow-up. Anyway, in the meantime, thank you so much for checking out this video. I really appreciate it. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already done so. Click that like button if you like this video, and I will see you in the next video.